And often our culture is shaping how we think about work in ways that we don't even realize it's shaping it. So what I really tried to attempt to do in very quick, broad strokes of, going over, decades of time in a flash, was to look and see how has it sort of changed? How have we come to this point where so much of our so many women are in the workforce? How is our understanding and our thinking about that changed in our American culture and context? Obviously, this would be very different in other parts of the world. They wrestle with these issues in different ways because they've been shaped differently. But this is our experience for the most part, and what's kind of led to our experience. And really learned a lot about feminism and its impact as I was studying this. But there are actually like 3 different waves of feminism that we've sort of experienced in our culture, and they've changed how we've thought about these things. There are resources if you're more interested in studying those topics that I read, and I can recommend books, and they're in the footnotes as well. But if you are interested in learning more about these things, because these are obviously very quick overviews. So at the beginning of the historical context chapter, I kind of started with a little bit of some of the kind of biblical historical context way from the beginning. Eve obviously worked alongside Adam in the garden and continued to work at his side after the curse. The Proverbs 31 woman worked. She worked with her hands. She bought a field and planted a vineyard. She engaged in trade. Her work was a great benefit to her family. We see that in verses 11 and 27. In the midst of an ever-shifting culture and the changing face of workplace, there's been a sea of controversy about a woman's proper role in the workplace. And the purpose of this chapter is to re-examine that historical context that's brought us to the current status of women in the workplace, and examine the various influences of feminism that has impacted us as well. So really prior to the early 1900s, for the mainstream American culture, women were very active working, but we had a much more agrarian society. So business was very home-based. So a wife she would basically learn her husband's trade, whatever that was, when she married, and be in some way, shape, or form engaged in that trade with him. Whether they lived in a farm and it was an agrarian context, which of course was for many people, or whether they lived in a very small town and he was, the shoemaker or the butcher or whatever. Often they had the business on maybe the first floor or the front of their house, and then they would live in the same property where they did their work, and so she could be engaged in that with him and still also be engaged in family life. It was all just sort of part of life altogether. That began to really change with industrialization in our country, and Americans started working outside of their homes a lot more, both men and women. The labor movement began to grow at that time because as industrialization happened, then you had workers moving into sort of newly dangerous kinds of fields. I mean, not that there wasn't plenty of danger, and I'm sure plenty of coppersmiths and silversmiths had accidents in their homes too, but there was an awareness of those things in a different context because of some of the things that occurred in factories and new sorts of contexts like that. During that era, women's occupations were generally a lot less hazardous than men's, because you still had a sense of men doing certain harder labors from a physical standpoint. They were really engaged in the railroad and mining and steel industries, which had very high accident rates. I think we probably all remember from U.S. history the infamous Triangle Shirtwaist Company factory fire, which was a huge piece of what really sort of spawned the labor movement and gave it, literally fuel. It killed 146 workers and was a major factor in establishing standards for factory workers, particularly women, but men as well, because it was mostly women in that case that were killed. The suffrage movement also began to grow during that time. And women, about a third of all women were, or about a third of all college students at that time were women. And so as women were becoming, had more opportunities for education, there was the first wave of feminism that really pushed for the right to vote. And while I think it's important when we talk about feminism that we don't go so far with our criticisms that we think, let's just throw it all out, like it was all bad. I mean, I don't think any of us are like upset that we have the right to vote. And I don't think there's anything wrong biblically with the fact that we can vote. But it's also important that we recognize the way those things have influenced and shaped other parts of our understanding. Because along with this push to be able to vote, that early phase of that first wave of feminism, it also had a lot of other social and really anti-God religious tones to what they were propagating and presenting to people. Just wanting to vote was only one piece of the movement and how they were impacting people. So the war broke out before they attained the right to vote, and that obviously which was the Great War, or the First World War as we look back at it now. And that obviously sort of put a lot of social movement causes on hold. But interestingly enough, both World War I and World War II thrust women into the workplace in ways that they hadn't been thrust into the workplace before. And the sort of combining time frames here, after the Great War, many of those women then left the workforce and went back home when the men came home from war. After the Second World War, there was a real tension and clash because many of the women didn't want to leave the workforce when the men came home. And there was this conflict because, obviously there weren't the same number of jobs to go around. During the war, there was like a huge push to get them all into the workforce because they were needed for the war effort, just from a social perspective. But after the war, then you have all these men coming home that need good jobs to support their families that they're coming home to. And women thought, well, I have this great job, but I don't want to give it up. And so it really changed the way that women looked. And again, we're seeing another reality of how much sort of just social situational things were really driving people's opinions about what should occur or shouldn't occur, as opposed to being grounded in a conviction-based approach to what they thought about these things. In the midst of all of that, going back to sort of the aftermath of the First World War, it was not long after the war that the suffrage amendment was added to the Constitution, so women got the right to vote. And it was about 1920, or in 1920, that Margaret Sanger wrote Women and the New Race. She was basically the founder of what became Planned Parenthood. So she was a huge proponent of, what she would have referred to as women's rights. And she mixed that together with pushing for the right to vote. But she was also a staunch proponent of birth control. And what's most frightening about her and her philosophies is what was really underlying that. She was a proponent of eugenics, which was the same movement that's sort of behind the Nazi, the same philosophy that was behind the Nazis, in terms of basically she felt that all of these children were the reason that there was poverty and unhappiness in the world, and if people could just control the number of children they had, everyone would be happy. We wouldn't have any more poverty or crime or bad things. Well, okay, clearly this is not a biblical perspective. She saw, and there's reasons about her past in terms of things that she saw. I mean, I think, if I'm remembering right, I think she saw her own mother die in childbirth, and she